Hello and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our sixth session in this Connect to Learning Series 3, which is focusing on education neuroscience. Today we have with us Dr. Mel Romualdez, but I'll introduce her later. Before we start, I would like to let you know that you can put your comments, questions in the Q&A, so that we will then return to them and maybe manage to answer a few of them. And I would also like to inform you that later on in the session, I will be sharing with you the Google form so that you can register your attendance. I will also like to inform you that the session that we had last week that we had to postpone will now be done on Tuesday, 3rd January 2023, same time, 5 p.m. But we will again inform you about this through an email. Thank you. The word to you, Erica.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank Mel for accepting our invitation to give an overview on the facts and misconceptions about autism. And as we have mentioned in our previous webinars, our aim in organizing these professional development sessions is to create awareness and a better understanding of the development of the brain within the context of teaching and learning. Teachers who use a scientifically informed approach to evaluate educational assertions will be able to help their pupils more effectively. And more importantly, these webinars also aim to create a bridge, a common language between science researchers and practitioners, as well as parents, enhancing evidence-based strategies, which are more likely to succeed with today's students. Thank you. Hope you enjoy this informative talk. James, on to you.
Thank you, Erica. Just a few words to introduce Mel. Mel is a lecturer in the psychology based at the Center for Research in Autism and Education at the Institute of Education, UCL, Faculty of Education and Society. She lives and works in London, United Kingdom. Prior to becoming an autism researcher, Mel worked for several years as a teacher in a specialist setting for autistic children in New York. She primarily taught autistic adolescents and young adults, helping to prepare them for the transition from school to employment by coaching them at job sites throughout the East Harlem community. Through her work as a teacher and job coach, she developed an interest in transition planning, adult support services, and employment for autistic people. She earned her doctorate at University College London under the supervision of Professor Anna Remington, and has continued her research on autism and employment since completing her PhD. She has also expanded her research portfolio to include social services for autistic adults in the UK, anxiety in autistic children, and autistic people's experiences of sensory sensitivities. Just a little abstract about her talk today. In this talk, she will begin by discussing the language we use to talk about autism, and how this ties into the neurodiversity paradigm, as well as the social model of disability. She will briefly give an overview of autism with a focus on social and non-social aspects, then address certain misconceptions about the diagnosis. Finally, she will speak about autism and inclusive education practices before ending the talk with a look at how we can build a more inclusive world for autistic people beyond education and especially in workplaces. The word to you, Mel, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, James and Erica, for inviting me, and thank you to all of you who are attending today. If any of you are football fans, thank you for missing the World Cup match just to listen to me speak. I hope that it's worth it. So as James mentioned, I work at the Center for Research in Autism and Education. And just briefly about CRAE. CRAE is a laboratory at UCL that really prides itself on conducting research that is outward facing. We really listen to the autism community in terms of what their priorities are. We listen to stakeholders such as parents and educators such as yourselves when trying to decide what we want to conduct our research on. And we hope that our research outcomes are immediately beneficial and directly beneficial to autistic people and their families and other stakeholders. So that's CRAE's ethos. I'm sure many of you know a lot about autism, but I just wanted to very briefly talk about the language that I'm going to use today, with a preface that I understand that many people might have a different opinion. They might prefer person-first language, for example, but I'm just going to explain to you why I choose to use identity-first language when I talk about autistic people and when I write about autistic people in my research. So first, I tend not to use the word disorder when talking about autism. And for that very reason, I also don't use the acronym ASD because the D in ASD stands for disorder. The neurodiversity paradigm, which I'm going to speak about next in a minute, holds that autism is actually a neurotype. It's a way of thinking, it's a person's way of being and looking at the world, it's their experience of the world. So I tend to hold the neurodiversity paradigm as true when I'm conducting my research and talking about my research. So rather than a disorder, I refer to autism as a neurotype. I also use the word autistic, or autistic person, autistic student, which is identity first language, rather than a phrase like person with autism or that student has autism. A person that has autism is person first language, whereas autistic is identity first language. And the reason for that is because many autistic people, and this is based on research, and their families and those closest to them prefer the identity first language. Now, I absolutely understand the perspective of using person first language. And of course, I respect anyone's opinion when they choose to use person first language. But for myself, when I speak about autistic people, I use identity first language. And that tends to tie more closely in with the neurodiversity paradigm. When I talk about autism, I also don't use the word deficit. I prefer to think of autistic traits as differences, with the acknowledgement that, of course, there are many things that are difficult for autistic people. So I don't use deficit-based language when talking about autism. And this ties into the medical model versus the social model of disability. And just to briefly introduce these two things, the medical model is the more traditional model that has sort of guided autism research, especially the earliest decades of autism research. It holds that deficits are inherent in autistic people and it's part of the condition of autism. The focus is mostly on treating or even curing autism and core autistic traits within this medical model. And it also heavily leans toward the view of autism as a disadvantage for people. The social model of disability, on the other hand, which was first conceived by Oliver and Sapie many years ago, is that disability does exist and the word disabled is not a bad word. It is important to acknowledge that people are disabled by society, though. So disability is the result of society creating barriers to inclusion. And being autistic is not something that can be changed or cured. Rather, as I said before, autism is a neurotype. It's not inherently bad or undesirable. It is a difference. And this social model of disability aligns very closely with the neurodiversity perspective, which I've mentioned, and which I'm going to go into a little bit more in detail on the next slide. So what is the neurodiversity paradigm? I'm sure many of you have heard of this before. And I really like this quote about the neurodiversity paradigm and what neurodiversity is, which is from the National Symposium on Neurodiversity. And this is that neurodiversity is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. These differences can include dyspraxia, dyslexia, ADHD, dyscalculia, autism, Tourette syndrome, and others. So neurodiversity doesn't just refer to people who are not neurotypical. It actually includes neurotypical people too. We can say that all of us are neurodiverse. As a human species, we are neurodiverse. Any population of people is neurodiverse. But people often say neurodiverse when what they really mean is neurodivergent. So when you're referring to someone who doesn't have that typical neurotype, who may have ADHD or who may be dyspraxic or dyslexic or autistic, what you mean is that they are neurodivergent. And that is the word that I use to describe people who don't conform to that typical neurotype. So what is autism? It is many different things for different people. I think it was Stephen Shore, the famous autistic scholar, who said, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. In fact, there are more variations in the autistic population than there are in the general population. So every autistic person is different. If we are holding with the neurodiversity perspective, we can say that autism is an identity for many people, and it's a different way of experiencing the world. If we refer to the APA's definition, which is in the DSM-5, it's a collection of traits that are commonly, but not always, and this is important, present. So, some common autistic traits that we might see are a preference for routine and predictability. I've had many autistic students who really liked doing the same thing every day, and they liked a schedule so that they knew exactly what was expected of them throughout their day. Repetitive stereotype behaviors. You might have some students who engage in stimming, rocking, for example, playing with their hands, or playing with a fidget spinner, or anything like that, which might be considered stimming. There are social communication differences in autism. I've spoken to many autistic people who tell me that it's easier for them to communicate with other autistic people rather than speaking to non-autistic people, because communication patterns and the way that they understand social situations are so different. As you can imagine, this might create a lot of barriers, especially in a place like the workplace or at school for autistic people when interacting with other non-autistic people. This has not yet been included, but it's increasingly evident that many autistic people also experience sensory sensitivities. So this can be an aversion to bright lights, or the feeling of having very intense headaches when, for example, they sit in a room for too long that has fluorescent lighting. Of course, an aversion to loud noises. You might have a lot of students who like to wear ear defenders or noise canceling headphones because of these sensory sensitivities. I've spoken to some autistic students who tell me that they hear everything in the room at the same volume. So imagine trying to do work in a room where perhaps there's a fly buzzing in the window. One of my students, for example, could hear a fly in the classroom and no one else could. We looked for that fly for 45 minutes and finally found it. And as soon as we got rid of that fly, he was back on task. So imagine being able to hear things that no one else can really hear. There's also a lot of sensory sensitivity to smell that autistic people tell me, or that I've seen autistic people experience in my classroom and in my colleagues. So those are just some things that might be features and that you might see in a lot of autistic people. But it's important to understand, like I said before, that every autistic individual is different. So they might not have a preference for routine, or they might not have certain sensory sensitivities to sound. But because these are common, they are listed, well, the first three are listed in the DSM-5 as traits. So just to reiterate, because every autistic individual is different, it's not experienced in the same way by every autistic person. As I mentioned before, I have had students who loved routine and others who needed to do something different every hour or every day because they got bored. I don't like to refer to autism as a disorder or a disease that needs to be cured. It is, however, in my view, a disability. There are certainly things that are difficult for autistic people. Most of the time, however, I can confidently say that this is due to the environment. For example, in my employment research, I've had a lot of autistic people tell me that if they were just given a quiet place to work, they could be completely on task and do their jobs better. But many workplaces just don't cater to different needs of different neurotypes. An open plan workspace, for example, does not work very well for many autistic people, and yet it seems to be increasingly the norm in workspaces. I know these two terms, high functioning and low functioning, have also been used very commonly in the past, but there is an increasing amount of pushback against using high functioning or low functioning to describe autistic people or autistic children. I tend not to use these, and on the next slide, I'll explain why. But rather than talking about high functioning and low functioning, and a spectrum that is linear, I tend to think of autism as a profile of strengths and challenges that vary from one area of life to another, but also across different situations. So for example, you might have an autistic person who is highly verbal in social situations among friends, but might have a more difficult time among people they're unfamiliar with. So their communication differences are different across different situations. So this is an illustration of what people think the autism spectrum looks like, from less autistic to more autistic. And that would be from high functioning to low functioning. And the reason I reject those terms is because I think it places a false binary on autism And people who are seen as high functioning tend not to get the support they need in certain situations, whereas people who are seen as low functioning are denied agency and independence, when in fact, some of my students who have been described as low functioning are very capable of many different things. And it's really important to understand that autism is actually more something like this, where there are different spiky profiles. And if you've heard this term before, or if you haven't, a spiky profile might be that, an autistic person has really, really high social skills or is really extremely verbal, but needs a little bit more support in other things such as executive function tasks. So this is more closely, I think, to what the autism spectrum looks like, having, been a researcher for many years now, and also a teacher for autistic people. This seems to be more closely aligned with what we've seen in our research and also what I've experienced as a practitioner. So every autistic person has this unique set of strengths and challenges. These can fluctuate at any given time and in any given situation. I've got autistic colleagues who tell me that when they're stressed, they tend to shut down in terms of being able to verbally communicate. And that's when they need to communicate in other ways, using written instructions or email or something like that. Or they need to go away and recharge before regaining those communication skills. So these things can fluctuate. And you might see a student who can communicate or, do a skill or perform a skill really easily one day, and they might not be able to do it the next day. And it's important to look at the environment and the internal state of the student as well. If they're stressed, if they're tired, if they didn't sleep well, if they haven't eaten, and those things can certainly influence how they're performing that skill that day. So just to very briefly go over the non-social aspects of autism, I wanted to talk about some of these. I mentioned stimming before. It's also known as a stereotyped or repetitive behavior. As a teacher, I was encouraged very much. And it's because a lot of the management at the school believed that stimming was distracting for the students, letting them play with a fidget spinner, letting them rock back and forth, because they didn't look like they were listening or paying attention like a neurotypical student might, with their hands folded on the desk and making eye contact. We were told to stop all forms of stimming and discourage that behavior. What we've seen in recent research about stimming and by speaking to autistic people is actually stimming can have a very important function. For a lot of autistic people, engaging in stimming behaviors is actually calming. It helps them regulate themselves when they're extremely, when emotions are high or when they're stressed. They engage in these stimming behaviors, and that helps them equalize and get back to a more calm internal state. Of course, the exception here in terms of encouraging stimming behaviors would be those that are self-injurious. And I think what we want to do, and what I've tried to do many times as a practitioner in schools, is to redirect any kind of self-injurious behavior to a stim that serves the same function but doesn't hurt the student. Of course, that's easier said than done, but it just takes, it's just something to think about, that sometimes stimming can have an important function, and it can actually be harmful to stop someone from stimming. Sensory processing is something that's another non-social aspect of autism. A lot of autistic people experience these differences in sensory processing. We have a very interesting project going on at Cray on perceptual capacity in autistic people, and we're testing the idea that autistic people can actually process more things from the sensory world more than neurotypical people. So they have a higher capacity. And going back to that example of my student who could hear many different things at the same volume all at once, there is some support for this idea that sensory processing is different for autistic people. We've seen that many autistic people are also diagnosed with co-occurring conditions. The overlap, or the amount of people who are diagnosed with autism and also with ADHD, is huge. There might be, we don't know yet for sure, but there might be certain areas of the brain that overlap. And that's why you can see in an autistic brain that they might also exhibit signs of ADHD. Also differences in executive function. So I mentioned executive function earlier. It's just an umbrella term for the cognitive processes that you use for planning, for thinking about future tasks, for organization skills, etc. And we have seen in research most recently, I think one of the most elegant research studies that's been done has been from a PhD student named Lorcan Kenny, who now works for the UK's Autism Research Council. And he looked at differences in executive function for autistic people and found that they do, in fact, plan things differently or may need some extra support in terms of organizing and planning. And the last of these non-social aspects of autism is skills and abilities. So, for example, this relates to pattern recognition, for example. There are some governments around the world who have recognized that autistic people actually have this amazing ability to recognize patterns, or they're better at it, or they're faster at it. So, you know, they've used that to their advantage, and they've started hiring only autistic people to do certain jobs. My PhD supervisor, Professor Anna Remington, who's also the director of CRAE, did an amazing study where she tested autistic people versus neurotypical people and how fast they could scan x-rays of luggage for prohibited items. And the autistic people performed way better at this task than the non-autistic people. So there is some research to show that autistic people do have skills and abilities that are superior to those of neurotypical people. To go through the social aspects of autism. So this one I'm sure that all of you have heard of. It's been around for a while. In mid-1990s, Simon Baron-Cohen, who's a professor at Cambridge, came up with this idea of theory of mind. And theory of mind just says that this is a person's ability to imagine what another person is thinking, to see things from their perspective. He also came up with this word called mind blindness to describe autistic people, and said that they had this deficit in theory of mind, and that autistic people really struggled to see things from another person's perspective. This theory has been widely debunked. Autistic people themselves have told us that that's not true at all, but I think the most convincing support for this theory being wrong is that actually the tests that have been used to test theory of mind have also been proven to be very fallible and not very reliable. And I'll talk a little bit more about Simon Baron-Cohen on the next slide, because he's actually kind of shifted his focus to a different theory, the extreme male brain theory. And I will tie that into perceived gender differences in autism. Another one is the double empathy problem. And I highly recommend reading Damian Milton's work if you want to know more about how autistic people experience social interactions. So just to sum it up really quickly, the double empathy problem holds that communication is two-way. Fair enough. Of course, we know communication is two-way, but it's not just social communication differences in the autistic person that might create a mismatch. It's also the way that non-autistic people communicate. And because this is a two-way street and communication is a two-way street, it's actually both people's responsibility, or both people's differences that make it difficult for autistic and non-autistic people to understand and communicate with each other. And there's been some really elegant work done by Catherine Crompton up at the University of Edinburgh to empirically test the double empathy problem. And she has actually found evidence to show that autistic people communicate much better with other autistic people. And they do this flawlessly and perfectly as compared to when they have to communicate with non-autistic people. So rather than seeing autism as this disorder where communication deficits are inherent to autism, it's looking at it as a whole and looking at non-autistic people as being part of that communication. And also, by extension, having that responsibility to perhaps change the way they communicate so that autistic people can understand them better. This can apply to many different situations. In my own research, I've looked at how this can apply in workplaces, but also in schools. How do autistic and non-autistic peers interact and play with each other? Should we be only focusing on autistic people to change their behavior? Or should we be taking a whole school approach to making things more inclusive? Social motivation theory was another one by Dawson et al. That has been widely debunked because it held that autistic people, it's not that they don't have social skills, it's they have no motivation to socialize with other people. And we know that that's not true. I'm sure that you as educators, as parents, know that the children you work with or your children want friends. And so many autistic people have said that they want friends. It's just very difficult sometimes to be in a world that's not set up for them. Empathy is another one. So this was kind of an offshoot of the theory of mind, where by extension, Baron Cohen and colleagues said that autistic people tend to lack empathy because they can't imagine how another person is feeling. But if you've read the work of autistic advocates, wonderful people like Kieran Rose, who have spoken about how they actually experience empathy differently and show it differently, you will realize that actually autistic people can sometimes be hyper empathic. I read a blog post by an autistic advocate who said that when their friend's father passed away, they withdrew because they were feeling it so much that it was so difficult for them to interact with that friend. But this was, of course, viewed as being callous and not caring. So maybe autistic people just show empathy differently than neurotypical people, but it doesn't mean they don't have it. Camouflaging by Laura Hull. There's been some really great research done on camouflaging, and this is the attempt to hide or mask your autistic traits to fit in. And Laura Hull and Julia Cook and Will Mandy, for example, are some of the people who've done such great work on camouflaging. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more after this slide. So I mentioned the extreme male brain theory of autism, and this is a theory that Simon Baron-Cohen has propagated that says that the female brain is more into empathizing versus the male brain, which focuses more on systemizing, organization. And he believes that the male brain is more systemizing, and it is a feature of autism to have more of a male brain. Now, he says that this doesn't mean that only males can be autistic, of course. Females can also have this systemizing brain. But some challenges to the extreme male brain theory, and there's a wonderful article by Cran and Fenton that was published in 2012 challenging the extreme male brain theory of autism. And one of the biggest problems that they've found with this is that it tends to gender autism, and it may lead to disparities in autism diagnosis. For example, we already know that girls are underdiagnosed. For many, many years, we believed that naturally there were more males than females who are autistic. But there's a lot of pushback against that lately, because in research, we've seen that actually there might just be a different female presentation of autism, and that's being missed by these diagnostic tools that were based on the male presentation of autism. So camouflaging, as I mentioned before, Hull et al., Will Mandy, Wood Downey et al. Have actually looked at camouflaging as a more female autistic trait, and that females tend to be better at it. They tend to be better at camouflaging or hiding their autistic behaviors or their autism. But of course, for this theory as well, there have been some people who've disagreed. Eric, for example, published this editorial in 2020, challenging the notion of camouflaging as a predominantly female autistic trait and the existence of a female autistic phenotype. The jury is still out on this, and I'm just presenting it because I think it's important to discuss these topics, and it's still up for debate. I personally agree with Laura Hull's and colleagues' research, as we've seen and spoken to many female autistic people who've said that they do tend to camouflage, and they also tend to sort of copy other people's neurotypical behaviors to fit in better. And this seems to be very much tied to gender. So this might be what you guys came here for. I know a lot of you are educators, professionals, parents, and I just wanted to talk about autism education. I only know much about the context in England, but I know some of you might come from other places. But just to give you an idea of the numbers, in England, an EHCP is basically, it's the same as an individualized education plan. Every student with a recognized disability should have an EHCP, and it's just an individualized plan to address their educational needs. So in England, over 25% of pupils have autism listed as their primary need. And that means that autism is actually the most common primary need for students in England. The format in England is there are both specialist and mainstream settings. Having worked in both, I think there are benefits to both, but let's see what parents have to say about that. So we've spoken to parents in some of our research, and other researchers have conducted studies where they've talked to parents about what they want for their children in terms of their education. So many say that they want provision geared toward the individual needs of the child. Others say they want experienced educators who are knowledgeable about autism and a highly structured yet flexible learning environment. And that, to me, and it might seem that way to you as well, that seems to be things that are found more in specialist settings. But parents also say this. They have high ambitions and aspirations for their children, of course. They want an inclusive ethos at the school, and they want better social skills education or opportunities for their children to practice social skills. And those tend to be found more in mainstream settings. So how do we reconcile those two things? How can we have, for example, an inclusive mainstream setting that also has individualized supports for the children and teachers who are highly knowledgeable about autism? So Rebecca Wood has published an amazing book called Learning About Inclusion from Autistic Teachers and Pupils. I highly recommend this book for any educators and parents out there. This is just about what inclusion can look like to be more appropriate for autistic students and also recognize their individual needs while having them in mainstream settings. So, in this book, she says that environments can trigger sensory sensitivities, and we have to be sensitive about that. And we have to be aware of that when having autistic children in our classrooms. There's a lack of appropriate support that seems to be in a lot of mainstream settings, lack of individualized or differentiated teaching, and of course, misunderstandings in interactions with peers and sometimes with teachers as well. But there is a case for inclusion because autistic pupils are already excluded from so many settings, and they will continue to be excluded from so many settings when they go on to workplaces, when they go into social situations as adults. It's also really important, I think, in mainstream settings that you're able to introduce neurotypical children to neurodiversity early on. So if an adult has never met an autistic person in their life, they might be a little bit more discriminatory and less understanding. And I've seen this so many times in workplaces where the misunderstanding of autism is the #1 reason why autistic people struggle to maintain employment or find employment. So, there's this wonderful program, and I could share that in the chat later on, called LEANS, and it's available worldwide. And it's a program for primary school teachers to teach children about neurodiversity. And I think a mainstream setting can do that, where neurotypical children just interact naturally with peers of many different neurotypes. And of course, increased social interaction with peers is important. And just to mention, I've actually seen this in practice. It's easy to say all these things are great and this is the ideal mainstream setting, but does it actually work? There's a wonderful primary school in Tower Hamlets in London called Mayflower. We do a lot of work with them and a lot of research in their school. They have students of all neurotypes in each classroom, and the occupational therapists and the speech and language therapists are familiar to all the students. So they interact with all students, and it's not just a small subset of students who go to see them. And there are practices such as flexible seating and ear defenders available to everyone that benefit all students. For example, we're about to run a research project where we look at making ear defenders available to all students when and where they need them. And we're just going to see how that works. A PhD student at Frey, Heba Al-Jayusi, has just completed a wonderful study on flexible seating where the children were allowed to choose where they sat to complete their work. There were different kinds of things like exercise balls, rocking chairs, all those kinds of things. And it was wildly successful. And the children their learning was actually facilitated by being able to choose where they were sitting. So this is just from my years as a practitioner, but as educators yourselves, you know that knowing the children you work with as individuals is the best tool that you have in working with them. These are just some things that I've seen from the hundreds of students that I've worked with that have been really useful when teaching them. So being mindful of the learning environment and possible sensory challenges is one of them. It's one of the most important things I've learned as a teacher of autistic pupils. I mentioned sensory sensitivities. There might be things going on in the environment that we don't notice, but it could be making it really difficult for the children to learn. I've also learned to be hands-off as much as possible. As a young teacher, when I first started out, I tended to help my students immediately with everything. but I realized that learning through scaffolding was actually more beneficial to them. That if I just gave them a chance, sometimes they surprised me. And being able to take a step back and see if they can do it themselves first before stepping in, or offering the amount of support they need, but not over supporting them. That actually led to a lot of breakthroughs in learning. Communication isn't always verbal. That's something that's really helped me to remember when I'm talking. I've had many students who were non-speaking, but it got to a point where I understood their form of communication so well that it was almost like we were having a conversation. And that was so valuable to know that, sometimes verbal communication isn't possible in certain situations or ever for some students. And there are different ways to communicate it, but it's important that they have a way to communicate. And of course, providing explicit instructions, communicating expectations, making things clear, and decreasing the unpredictability of situations has been really important in working with autistic children and people, so older students as well. So this was one that I added in after a discussion with some colleagues, imposing neuronormative expectations on students. And this is something that I've been absolutely guilty of in my time as a teacher, expecting some of my autistic students to sit with their hands crossed, or with their hands clasped in front of them on a desk and make eye contact with me might not have been the best way to teach them. Some of these students benefited from not having to concentrate on my facial expressions when they were trying to listen to me. So just recognizing what's right for your students in terms of your expectations of them and how they pay attention best or how they learn best, instead of really just basing it on this neuronormative model of students looking perfect all the time. And I mentioned this before, but of course, knowing your students as individuals is key. And it's just been such a wonderful experience to get to know a child so well that you really see progress in their learning because of the way that you can respond to their individual needs. So just really quickly, and I'm aware that I've taken more time than I promised, but this will be done in about 3 to 5 minutes. So just beyond education, James mentioned in my bio that I've actually shifted more to working with autistic adults and trying to support more autistic young people into employment, and also autistic adults who are, much older, in their 40s and their 50s, because actually the current numbers for employment, especially for autistic adults in the UK, are quite bleak. Latest figures from the Office of National Statistics show that only 22% of autistic people are in employment. That is much lower than the general population. That figure is 81% for the general population, and it's actually the lowest figure for any disability group. So why do autistic people struggle so much with employment? I think it has something to do, especially my research has shown that it has something to do with those social communication differences, or just people not understanding autism. So my students asked me this question recently: how can autistic people integrate into society better? And I challenged this because I'd like to phrase it differently. How can we as a society become more inclusive of autistic and other neurodivergent people? I think for too long, a lot of our interventions and a lot of the ways that we address autistic people's differences in society have put so much responsibility on autistic people to change, to learn how to communicate better, to learn neurotypical social skills, to change their autistic traits or the way that they see the world or experience the world to fit in. But at CREATE, for example, we've shifted a lot of our research to seeing how we can make society a more inclusive place. And some ideas for this: just better access, making sure that the sensory environment, for example, is set up for many different people of different neurotypes, addressing people's needs, having that willingness to make reasonable adjustments, better training for other people. I've engaged in some training where I train employers who want to hire neurodivergent and autistic people, but aren't sure if their environment is set up for that. But being open to that is a really good first step for companies who do want to tap into autistic talent. Of course, increased understanding is our goal for these training sessions, but in general, I would hope that we as a society would increase our understanding about autism and really just come to and be a little bit more open-minded when we look at people who are neurodivergent and think differently and experience the world differently than we might as neurotypical people. And yes, I'm obviously a big advocate of the neurodiversity perspective, just recognizing that neurodiversity exists and appreciating the diversity in human minds and neurotypes. And just really briefly, as an employment researcher, I have to mention that we've actually seen that a lot of autistic people have traits that make them amazing employees. They bring strengths to the workplace, like I mentioned, increased perceptual capacity, increased pattern recognition, and there's a lot of research to back this up. So when I go to companies and tell them that they should be hiring more autistic people, these are the studies that I refer to. So yeah, 40 minutes. I hope that's okay, Erica and James, but at least we've got some time for questions.
Yes, thank you, Mel. That was really interesting. Some insights into this topic, which I think educators need a lot of, because every day we are facing children on the, with neurotypical neurotypes, actually. I'm not going to use the word disorders, as you said. I stopped myself from saying it. Let's start with the questions. One comment, in fact, is this is very interesting and valuable because autism is so common today. In fact, that's one of the things that I just mentioned. Every day, autism is increasing, in fact, in the classrooms. What do you suggest for autistic students who have a tendency to bite, scratch, hit their peers or educators?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And believe me, I've worked with many students who've had these kinds of behaviors. And of course, you want to stop that. That's unacceptable just for their own safety and other people's. This is a very, very specific answer, because I can only speak to this as, with individual students I've worked with. For example, I had a student who would bite their hand all the time, to the point where, it would bleed, and they had some really, really serious scar tissue forming on the hand. We tried so many things, and this is the first step. I think being open to trying many different things and moving on when those things don't work. Our first solution was to tie rubber tubing to their wrist, but they bit their hand anyway. It was less interesting to them. Their parent asked us to wrap their hands with bandages, which seemed to work as well. We just had to find the right material so that they couldn't bite through the bandage to their skin. But it was so difficult to redirect this behavior. And I absolutely feel for you, when you're trying to stop them, but it's something they really want to do. Maybe it has some kind of sensory function. Trying to redirect, I think, would be the first. Something different that they can do, giving them different toys that they can use that might serve the same function, but it really is a process of trial and error. But to immediately address the danger, I would put some kind of barrier there, like we did with the bandages, and eventually fingerless gloves, just to stop them from hurting themselves immediately while we tried to work on addressing the function of the behavior and trying to find a replacement for it.
Okay, so our next question. As a counselor in schools, I have been privileged to meet students with autism. These students have taught me a lot, especially as I communicate with students in a humanistic approach. Can you kindly share with us the program that you shared regarding how primary schools may become more neurodiverse?
Okay, so I'm going to put this in the chat here. It's called, let me just see. Oh, I don't think I can actually... if you'd like to, I'll just say it's called LEANS. So LEANS stands for Learning About Neurodiversity in Schools. It's wonderful. It was put together by the Salveson Mind Room Research Center, which is run by Professor Sue Fletcher Watson. One of my former Cray colleagues, Dr. Alyssa Alcorn, is actually the postdoctoral researcher in charge of the LEANS project. Check them out. There's a website. They have committed to making the LEANS resource pack free to all educators and parents for all time in its entirety. So it's completely free and downloadable from their website. So LEANS, it's wonderful. They've got some really, really great feedback from this. And what I love about LEANS is that they developed it with a lot of input from autistic people as well. So they had hugely neurodivergent staff working on this research to develop this resource pack.
Mel, I could email you and you can give me the site, because the
sure.
recording goes onto my blog and they can access it from there. So now you can, they can have access to it from my blog. In your experience or in the literature, do you find a higher proportion of transgender males that is assigned female at birth amongst autistic individuals? Just thinking about the extreme male brain idea.
Actually, I would say that that goes both ways. And I don't think it has to do with the extreme male brain theory, to be honest with you. So just to give you a specific answer, we've conducted surveys with thousands of people. And of course, in the process of conducting these surveys, we've had to gather demographic information. And it seems every single time we do a large study like this, that there is a higher proportion of transgender autistic people who answer this survey than there are transgender people in the general population. But reading research from autistic people who've actually, spoken about their experiences of gender, they say that the way they experience gender in general as autistic people, and it might have something to do with their autistic brain, with their neurotype, is very different from how they understand neurotypical people experience gender. And I think that's why we see more gender fluid people or non-binary autistic people or transgender autistic people when we are looking at demographics of the autistic population.
Okay, another interesting question. I'm having to home educate my 11-year-old daughter who is on a waiting list for an autism assessment because she couldn't manage the transition to secondary school. Group activities are tricky, but I really want to provide a rich variety of activities. Do you have any suggestions for home educated autistic children? So
one of the things that I've learned works so well with autistic students is to tap into her special interests. So if your daughter has anything that she's really interested in, Lego, for example, any like specific show or character on a show, if you can use them in the materials. I once taught a class to a bunch of 5-year-olds dressed as a firefighter because one of the students was having a really tough time paying attention in class, but would pay attention to a firefighter because they were so into firefighters at the time. So I think that would be a really good first step to get her interested and motivated to do any of that like work that might be aversive at this point. If she finds school kind of aversive or, has had a really bad experiences at school, just using those special interests, they can be so powerful, I think, as a tool.
And I think it's with all children.
Yeah.
When you base your teaching on their interests, I think they're more engaged. So another question, actually autistic is used in social media to differentiate between people who are actually autistic and those that talk, open quote, talk about us without us, close quote, like Autism Speaks. Does this sort of distinction exist in academic research settings as well?
Yes, and I think that there's actually quite a bit of interaction between, well, I should hope, between academics on Twitter and the actually autistic community. Well, we at CRAE, for example, we don't do anything without autistic people. We take a participatory approach to our research, and that means not just autistic people as participants in research, which they've always been, but including autistic people in the decision-making process from the very beginning, from writing grants for projects that look at ways we can help the autistic community. We always have autistic co-researchers on our team. And we have autistic colleagues at CRAE. So I think the distinction is important. I think the actually autistic community has found this wonderful space on Twitter, which I hope Twitter doesn't collapse, because I think it's just been so wonderful for, I've seen so many autistic people, for example, who are newly diagnosed, late diagnosed adults who have found their tribe on Twitter because of the actually autistic hashtag. But I want to believe that academics who are really serious about doing research for the benefit of autistic people would listen to the community. And I'd like to see more of that interaction, whereas keeping that hashtag for only autistic people is really important too, because it helps people find each other.
So thank you for your presentation. In your experience, how can you tell the difference between autism and co-occurring conditions, for example, ADHD, when neurocognitive, one moment, when neurocognitive or social affective traits overlap?
So that is not something that I can answer myself, because actually the jury is still out on that as well. There's actually, I saw a great graphic posted by an actually autistic person on Twitter the other day, where there was ADHD traits, autistic traits, and AuTHD in this Venn diagram, and that intersection of AuTHD, where, you know, I've spoken to people who have both diagnoses, and they say, like, sometimes I don't know where my autism and my ADHD overlap. I think we need to understand this better. There hasn't been a ton of research on distinguishing them from one another. Because there's so much overlap, I think it's just something that needs to be explored. And I'm so sorry that I can't answer that more completely, just because I don't think we have enough evidence to separate the two.
Okay, so another question. Hi, I am a tutor with autistic children between the ages of 3 to 5. I have children with different abilities, and most of them do much better in our institute than at school. However, I have children who, although they are able to verbally express themselves and are doing really well both at school and in our institute, are being really aggressive and not cooperating at all at home. What factors could be leading to such behavior?
So as a teacher, I used to conduct home consultations with my students, because their parents would say exactly that they act so different from when I see them at school and when they're working with you guys, and then when I see them at home. And I think the environment has a lot to do with it. It is a lot of control. I think, you know, to a certain extent, that's true for everyone. You act certainly very differently once you get home from work than you do at work in the office. But I think from years of maybe being conditioned to learn in a certain environment with certain expectations, you know, their behavior can absolutely change because they go home and they know that they can behave a certain way differently. But I would say, you know, I would suggest maybe more interaction between you and the parents if they're having specific difficulties at home, to see what works at school. It's really difficult though when, you know, children know they have certain expectations in one environment and they know they can relax in others. That's another factor too. You know, I mentioned that when I was a teacher starting out, that I was encouraged to stop my students from stimming. So I would spend all day stopping my students from stimming. And the second one of my students got home, they would engage in all of their stimming behaviors. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes,
The
yes.
connection dropped really quickly.
We can
Okay,
hear you, man.
It's back. So,
Okay.
you know, it's just the control of the environment.
Okay. Internet connection is unstable.
Yes, Erica, we'll wait for a couple of minutes.
Okay.
If Mel doesn't manage to connect again, we'll close this session.
Yes. Okay.
We'll just wait for a couple of minutes. Maybe she can reconnect.
Okay. There's another interesting question which I would like to ask.
Let's see if she joins again. Maybe we can bring this to a close, Erica, because
Yes.
I think there's just 5 minutes left. So.
Okay.
Yes, I think I would have liked to thank Mel for her presentation. It was really, really interesting. And also the questions, but some really, really good questions on the topic, because it's of interest to many people. Just a reminder about our last webinar, which is the webinar which we had to postpone last week. Okay, Mel is back with us now. So I've put in the registration form for those who would like to register for the webinar on January 3rd, 2023, which will be delivered by Erica on regulating emotions in the classroom.
regulating children's emotions in the classroom. It's very, very interesting. So
Yes.
make sure you come along.
Okay.
I think we
Erica.
better.
Yes, I think we
close off.
better close here. I would like to thank Erica, also Mel, who will send her an email to thank her for her contribution, and also to all of you who have joined us today. We'll be posting the recording of the webinar on the Faculty of Education Facebook page, and we'll also inform you about other news that we'll have about possible webinars in the future. Thank you very much, and a nice
Thank
evening
you.
to all. Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.